How'd you like to help save the world?
Why would you kidnap two people only to take them somewhere safe, sit them down, and ask them if they want to save the world? That is the part of Daniel's and Helen's storyline that I can't get out of my head, because everything about the way these two are handled suggests that we're supposed to think they're in danger. Their car is intercepted. They're taken off the road. There's a mysterious man following their movements. They have no idea who's controlling the situation or where they're being taken. And then they arrive at a private hangar. No execution, no interrogation, no ransom. Instead, Senator Rosalind Thurman looks at them and essentially offers them a job. How'd you like to help save the world? That doesn't sound like the end of a kidnapping. It sounds like the beginning of a recruitment. And if that's what we're watching, then I think we've been asking the wrong question about Stenson and the mysterious gray-suited man. Maybe the mystery isn't who is trying to kill Daniel and Helen. Maybe it's who needs Daniel and Helen alive. Because somebody has gone to an extraordinary amount of trouble to make sure these two people arrive at exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. And I think the reason may have something to do with the beginning of the Silo project itself. Look at Daniel's and Helen's situation. They're not random people. Daniel is a congressman. He has access to government, politicians, institutions, and information that an ordinary person simply doesn't have. Helen is a journalist, and not the kind who conveniently stops asking questions when somebody tells her to. We've already seen that she's willing to protect a confidential source, even when doing so threatens her career. Put those two people together, and you have something incredibly useful. One understands how power works from the inside. The other understands how information moves from the inside out. And now they're being pulled into something neither of them fully understands. That's why I don't think their selection is accidental. If you're preparing for something enormous, a war, a political crisis, a technological catastrophe, something that could potentially threaten civilization itself, these are exactly the kinds of people you would want around you. But there's something else that makes their recruitment even more suspicious. The people controlling their movements already seem to know exactly where they need to go. The gray man doesn't behave like someone who has been sent to scare them. He behaves like someone who has been given instructions. Get Daniel, get Helen, move them, don't lose them, deliver them. And that's a very different role from a hitman. He's a handler, which means someone higher up is making decisions. And we still don't know who that person is. This is where Stenson becomes interesting, because we've been given just enough information about Per to make him suspicious, but nowhere near enough to understand what he's actually doing. We know he's a billionaire. We know he has purchased a huge piece of land in Georgia. And we know his name has been introduced into this before times mystery, at exactly the point when Daniel and Helen are being pulled deeper into whatever is happening behind the scenes. That doesn't automatically make him the villain. Actually, I think making Per the obvious mastermind would be too easy. What if Per is one of several people who knows something is coming? What if he isn't building the silo system himself? What if he's preparing for the same catastrophe that Senator Thurman is preparing for, but he has a completely different idea about how humanity should survive it? That possibility would make the entire storyline much bigger, because now we're not dealing with one secret organization. We're dealing with powerful people who may know the same terrifying truth, but disagree about what to do with it. And suddenly, that piece of information about Per buying land starts to feel different. Why buy that much land? Why there? What are you planning to build? And more importantly, what did Per know when he bought it? Because if he knew about the coming disaster before the public did, then Per isn't simply some wealthy man with eccentric interests. He's somebody preparing for the future. And that brings us back to Thurman's line. Save the world. It's a very dramatic thing to say. But maybe that's exactly why we should take it seriously. Because Thurman doesn't say, we need your help. She doesn't say, there's a problem. She says, save the world. That suggests Daniel and Helen are being brought into a situation where the stakes are already enormous. And I think there's a possibility that the show is slowly showing us the philosophical birth of the silos. Not the construction, not the algorithms, not the underground buildings. The idea. Because before somebody builds a silo, somebody has to believe that humanity needs to be protected from itself. Somebody has to believe that normal society can't survive whatever is coming. And somebody has to make the most uncomfortable decision of all. If you can't save everyone, who gets saved? That's the question hiding underneath the entire silo story. We've already seen the consequences of that philosophy. The algorithm makes decisions based on the survival of the larger population. Individual lives become numbers. Memories become something that can be manipulated. Rebellion becomes a threat to stability. And people are expected to accept horrific decisions because they're told those decisions are necessary for survival. But somebody had to invent that logic. And maybe Daniel and Helen are about to meet the people who did. There's also something fascinating about Helen's position in all of this. She's a journalist. Her instinct is to investigate. She spent her career looking for information that powerful people would rather keep hidden. And now she's being invited into the biggest secret imaginable. Think about how perfect and potentially dangerous that is. The person whose entire profession is built around exposing secrets is being given access to a secret that could change the fate of humanity. Would she really be able to walk away? And perhaps more importantly, would the people recruiting her actually trust her? Because if you're building a secret survival plan, the last thing you want is a journalist asking questions about it. Unless you actually need the journalist. Maybe Helen isn't being recruited because she can keep a secret. Maybe she's being recruited because she can uncover one. Maybe there are things even the people behind this operation don't know. And Helen's ability to find information could eventually become one of their most valuable tools. Daniel has political connections. Helen has investigative instincts. That's not a random pair. That's a team. And then there's the gray man. I keep coming back to him because the show has gone out of its way to make him feel important without telling us why. He's not given some huge monologue explaining his motivations. He doesn't announce who he works for. He simply appears whenever the story needs someone to move Daniel and Helen through this hidden world. That's what makes him dangerous. We don't know whether he's working for Thurman, we don't know whether he's connected to Pear, and we don't even know whether those two people are working together. What if they're not? What if the gray man belongs to a completely different organization? Imagine that. Thurman is preparing one solution. Pear is preparing another. And somewhere between them is this anonymous network of people moving information, money, scientists, politicians, journalists, and resources into position. Daniel and Helen have accidentally walked into the middle of it, and they don't even know which side they're on yet. That would explain why the show is keeping Pear so mysterious. Because perhaps we're not supposed to ask, is Pear the villain? We're supposed to ask the following: what does Pear know? Those are very different questions. And if Pear knows something, then his land purchase becomes one of the most interesting clues we've been given. Because land is permanent. You don't buy a massive piece of land in preparation for something unless you're thinking long-term. Maybe he's building something. Maybe he's hiding something. Maybe he's preparing a facility. Or maybe he's securing a location that will become important once everything else falls apart. And if that's connected to the silo project, then we may be looking at the earliest stage of the entire operation, not the moment the silos become prisons. The moment somebody decides they need to exist. That's potentially much more important. Because the biggest mystery in Silo isn't really who built the silos. It's why did intelligent people decide that building them was necessary? What happened? What did they know? And what were they trying to prevent? Daniel and Helen may be getting closer to the answer without even realizing it. But there's one thing that bothers me. If Thurman genuinely wants to save the world, why does she need to operate this way? Why intercept Daniel and Helen? Why use someone like the Gray Man? Why hide whatever is happening? Why not simply tell them the truth? Unless the truth is something so dangerous that revealing it too early could make the situation worse. And that would fit the Silo universe perfectly. Because secrecy is always justified in the name of survival. That's how these systems are born. Someone says, we can't tell them yet. Then they'll panic. Then they'll interfere. Then they'll destroy themselves. And eventually you arrive at a world where people aren't allowed to know anything because the people in power have decided that knowledge itself is dangerous. That's exactly the kind of slippery slope that could lead from Senator Thurman's meeting to the world Juliet is living in thousands of years later. And if that's where this storyline is heading, then Daniel and Helen aren't just investigating the origins of the silo. They may be witnessing the moment the philosophy behind it begins. Which brings me back to the question I started with. Why were Daniel and Helen taken alive? Because I don't think the answer is simply that somebody wanted to interrogate them. I think somebody needed them. Daniel has political access, Helen has investigative ability, and both of them are still outside the system. They haven't been conditioned to accept the idea that extreme measures are necessary. They can still look at something horrible and say the following: no, there has to be another way. And maybe that's exactly what the people behind the operation need to overcome. Because if the silos really are born from a plan to save humanity, then the hardest part isn't building underground cities. The hardest part is convincing people that living inside one is better than living outside. And that's where people like Daniel and Helen become useful. They can help build the argument, they can help uncover the information, they can help shape public opinion, or they can become the people who realize the plan has gone too far. And I think that tension is going to be crucial. So here's where I land on the theory. I don't think Stenson is necessarily the mastermind. I don't think the gray man is necessarily the mastermind either. And I don't think Senator Thurmond necessarily knows everything. I think we're looking at the early formation of something much bigger. Different powerful people may know that a catastrophe is coming. They're preparing their own solutions. Some are working through government, some are working through private wealth, and others are operating completely in the shadows. The gray man is simply one of the people making those plans happen. And Daniel and Helen have been selected because they each possess something the people preparing for the future desperately need. But here's the part that could completely change the story. What if the people trying to save humanity are also the people who eventually decide that humanity can no longer be trusted? Because that's the real tragedy of Silo. The system doesn't have to begin as evil. It can begin with people trying to do the right thing. They see catastrophe coming. They want to save lives. They make compromises. They justify secrecy. They decide some freedoms are too dangerous. And one compromise becomes another, until eventually, someone creates a system where millions of people are kept underground, their memories are controlled, their choices are restricted, and an artificial intelligence decides who gets to live. So when Thurmond looks at Daniel and Helen and asks them if they want to help save the world, I don't think the important question is whether she means it. I think she probably does. The terrifying question is, what does saving the world mean to her? Because if Daniel and Helen accept that offer, they may not be joining the people who are trying to prevent the silo, they may be joining the people who are about to create it. And per Stenson, he may be preparing for the same future. The gray man may already be working to build it. And Daniel and Helen may have just been given their first invitation into the conspiracy that eventually becomes the world of Silo. The question isn't whether they're being recruited. They clearly are. The question is, who are they being recruited by? And what happens when Daniel and Helen finally discover what they're actually being asked to save?